Yeah, hi folks. Now it appears from the comments in my last video that some people would like to see the Royals cancelled, and I can understand why. But they should be careful of what they wish for, because big moves like that often come with unintended consequences. Remember the EU? Everyone wanted to belong to it until they saw their sovereignty go, along with their personal identity. And in New Zealand, during the overdue free market reforms carried out by Roger Douglas in the 80s, globalisation was the buzzword of the day. And look how that turned out. Anyway, let's have a look back.
The word revolution suggests chaos, guns, bloodshed, but there are other ways. Between 1984 and 1993, New Zealand had its own kind of revolution, one that would leave permanent changes in our culture. We became a laboratory for an experiment, the transformation of the world's first welfare state into the world's first post-welfare state. Around the world, gurus of market-driven economic theory watched in envy as a tiny nation in the South Pacific did an about-turn and marched in a different direction. For 50 years, New Zealand had been the model of the modern welfare state. Affluent and egalitarian, famous for butter, All Blacks and social ideals. We paid up to 66% in tax to sustain free health, education, housing and near full employment on the sacred 40-hour week.
Hey, listen, everybody, do you realize we got 2 TV channels here with crying eyes every time?
By the 80s, New Zealand was a strange animal among Western democracies. We boasted 2 television channels, both owned by the state, which also controlled who made the sets and for how much, what business you could be in, the prices you charged, the hours you worked, the wages you were paid, what you could buy and when, were all decided by the state.
In those days, we had a feudal economy. Every area of our economy was licensed, and if you had a license, you were protected and no one could break into your market.
Through the 70s, more than 40,000 public servants beavered away at regulations spawned by government controls. They caused absurdities. You needed permission from the railways to truck goods more than 150 miles. We had 2 brands of washing machine, both made by the same manufacturer. It took 6 weeks to connect a telephone. To subscribe to an overseas magazine, you needed a permit for funds. Some foreign goods couldn't be bought for any price.
You had to almost lie to be able to go overseas and have a holiday. You had to use credit cards, and then you had to explain to the Reserve Bank whether you bought shoes or paid hotel bills with your credit card, and had to write out explanations to the Reserve Bank how you'd spent your money in an overseas trip.
I used to represent the Prime Minister's Department on the Import Licensing Planning Committee, which was a big committee of Treasury and Industries and Commerce and various other people. And it was a huge joke. You know, here were us young kids and old kids, for that matter, sitting around debating whether the people should have more cans of sardines or more shoes in the coming year.
New Zealand businesses had nowhere to go except Wellington to lobby for permits. They couldn't expand overseas, so they looked for things to do within the terms laid down by the bureaucrats. Many lost the plot.
One of the proudest boasts within the company each year in our annual report was how many people we employed. Well, I mean, if you're expanding very greatly and it's a sign of great activity, that's wonderful. The fact is we were going backwards, but the fact that we employed lots and lots of people was sufficiently important to, you know, really get it right up there in the annual report. I mean, at one stage, again, we employed, I think, second to the Ministry of Works in terms of numbers of architects. We were a brewing company. We didn't need any architects.
Yeah, New Zealand really was a basket case and needed reforms urgently.
In those days, it was very easy for business to make a steady profit, an extremely good profit, because fundamentally we were totally protected. The person who paid for it was the working person who ended up paying twice what the Australians did for a very limited range of inferior goods.
At the start of the 80s, New Zealand was dry territory for shopaholics. Prices were high, choice was limited, and opening hours restricted. Tourists were astounded and spent their dollars elsewhere.
I don't know, the stores are all closed. We might as well go back to the hotel. There's nothing to do here.
Okay.
Guarding this protected fortress economy was one man, Prime Minister the Right Honourable Robert Muldoon.
Yeah, and one could easily argue that the British monarchy could do with some reform as well. Anyway, moving on.
In June 1984, Prime Minister Rob Muldoon called a snap election.
So we got a date, Prime Minister?
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give you much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
The campaign was short but vigorous.
God bless you, David. I've waited a long time for this.
Muldoon's dominating manner and heavy-handed control had eroded his popularity. Support had shrunk to a hard core of loyalists. While their minister travelled the campaign trail, the Treasury economists began writing a brief for the man they hoped would become their new boss, Roger Douglas.
Yeah, so this was going on before Roger Douglas came into power. Now, I didn't know that.
But this was no ordinary brief for an incoming minister. It was a comprehensive prescription for transforming the New Zealand economy.
Yeah, aided by the IMF, part of the UN cabal.
Corporate tax rates reduced to attract overseas investment, real wages cut, controls on foreign exchange transactions abolished, tariff and export incentives dropped. Where possible, government activities to be commercialised or sold. Welfare spending targeted and reduced.
Yeah, and all of that had to happen, but then the job losses began.
On April the 1st, 1987, the government gave up half its state assets, and the new state corporations began shedding employees. Electricity 3,000, coal 4,000, forestry 5,000, New Zealand Post 8,000.
Yeah, now I wasn't quite concerned about those job losses, because most of those jobs were fake anyway. But I was concerned about the private sector losing jobs to Asia, jobs that never came back.
Once again, it was the rural towns that took the body blows as state sector workers joined beleaguered farmers as the walking wounded of the reforms.
Well, the day we took over, we reduced the staff by 60%. So we had 2.5 times so many people as we needed. Now, that was right through the state sector. Every single SOE within 2 or 3 years of corporatisation reduced its staff by at least a half. So that was the fundamental efficiency. The other efficiencies, of course, are manifest. The government was extremely extravagant with capital. One of the first things we did with the Forest Service was collect all the excess bulldozers and machinery and gear and toys that the Forest Service had accumulated with this extra money it was getting. We put it in a big yard in Kyangaroa Forest. It was acres and acres of this equipment. We had a huge auction. I mean, this was equipment that, would make your eyes fall out. It was beautiful new plant. It was totally unnecessary. This is how the state spends your money.
Yes, this is how the socialist state spends your money, and they're still doing it today. And of course, the great globalisation hoax comes home to roost.
What's gone wrong? I think what's gone wrong essentially is that the globalizers overpromised and underdelivered. They promised that globalization would produce a world of obvious benefits for everybody, a more prosperous, a more stable, a more pleasant world. Well, they said that of course there'll be disruption, of course there'll be difficulties, of course people will have to change and adjust to that world, but overwhelmingly you will see improvements in your life. This clearly happened in the emerging world. I was in Qingdao not that long ago, a city I'd hardly ever heard of. Everybody there seemed prosperous. There were brand new cars, there were skyscrapers, people had jobs, there was a great sense of optimism. Everybody was looking forward to the future. That's a wonderful thing. But if you leave that world, the emerging world, and look at the rich world, what do you see? You see that America's standard of living has stagnated. The average American has seen their standard of living stagnating for the last 20 years. I recently went to Wolverhampton, the exact opposite of Qingdao, a world where people have seen their lives broken by deindustrialization, a world where people do not have hope for the future. And the worrying thing to me is that in this period of hyperglobalization, productivity growth has actually been much slower than it was from 1945 to about 1970, when you had a much more controlled version of globalization. So we were promised an acceleration in growth, and what we've seen in the rich world at least, productivity growth beginning to stagnate, a great stagnation.
Yeah, because the corporate communists have transferred all the jobs to China, and the UN sanctions the following.
The top 5 countries in white decline, or rather, the top 5 majority white countries that very soon will be minority white countries due to below replacement birth rates and even more so to mass migration from the third world. Before we actually look at these 5 countries and get into specific details about each, let's first take a general look at immigration on a global scale. In 2017, there were almost 258 million international migrants worldwide. The largest portion of these is from Asia, especially China and India, with 106 million. The second largest slice comes from Europe with 61 million, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean with 38 million, and then Africa with 36 million. Interestingly, only 4 million immigrants worldwide were born in North America. Now, out of these 258 million, 165 million of them, or roughly 2/3, are now living in high-income countries. High-income countries are defined by the United Nations and are shown here in dark blue. As you can see, these are for the most part white countries, with notable exceptions in Northeast Asia, such as Japan and South Korea, and also Persian Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Oman. The United Nations lists the 20 countries in 2017 which had the highest number of immigrants. Of the top 10 on that list, 8 of them are white countries. If current birth rates and immigration trends do not change, all of these countries will become minority white in the relatively near future. In the case of Europe, we are talking about lands that have been continuously inhabited by white Europeans for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, and of course the corporate communists love this because both legal and illegal immigration drives down wages. Now I think Jordan Peterson sums it up best.
And so early, you see, so early in the biblical narrative, you have a warning against hubris and some indication that properly functioning systems have an appropriate scale. I read an article in The Economist magazine this week about the rise of nationalist movements all over the world as a counterbalance to globalization. Maybe it's most marked with the European Economic Community. And The Economist writers were curious about why that counter-movement has been developing, but it seems to me that it's also a Tower of Babel phenomena, is that, and maybe this is most evident in the European Economic Community, to bring all of that multiplicity under the, what would you call it, under the umbrella of a single unity is to simultaneously erect a system where the top is so far from the bottom that the bottom has no connection to the top. You know, your social systems have to be large enough so they protect you, but small enough so that you have a place in them.
Yes, your personal identity.
And it seems to me perhaps that's what's happened in places like the EEC, is that the distance between the typical citizen and the bureaucracy that runs the entire structure has got so great that it's an element of destabilization in and of itself. And so people revert back to, say, nationalistic identities because it's something that they can relate to.
Exactly. And the same applies to the royals. Without them, millions of Brits will have nothing to relate to, nothing to identify with. Yeah, now having said that, if the climate change, Muslim appeasing, UN puppet Prince Charles becomes king, I would like to see the royals cancelled as well.